Rancher avoided women for 20 years, but her request changed everything. Vertical bar Wild West stories. Elias Stone's life on his sprawling ranch was a stark testament to 2 decades of self-imposed silence. His home, a solitary sentinel amidst the unforgiving hills, was less a dwelling and more a fortress, a tomb he had built around his grief. His only companions were the gentle lowing of his Hereford cattle, the soft nicker of his aged horse Shadow, and the mournful whisper of the wind through the barn boards. Human connection, especially with women, was a language he had deliberately forgotten, a dialect he swore he would never speak again. Yet on a morning cold enough to splinter stone, a jarring note disrupted his quiet symphony. As he watched the familiar trail, a steaming cup warming his calloused hands, he saw it, a gleaming carriage, the kind favored by men who bought and sold futures without a second thought, rolling away from the direction of the old haze. A place. It was a polished lie against the raw truth of the land, a stain on the pristine landscape. Elias's eyes narrowed, a cold stone settling in his gut. That carriage meant trouble. It always did. Minutes later, a figure emerged from the morning mist. A woman. She moved with a purpose that belied her slender frame. Though she appeared fragile, as if a strong gust might carry her away, a resolve in her eyes could cut through granite. She stopped at his gate, the heavy wood a stark boundary between his world and hers. She wasn't a beggar or a lost traveler. She was someone who had reached the end of one path and stood at the precipice of another. It was Clara Hayes, whose husband had died months prior, leaving her with a patch of land barely clinging to existence. She wasted no time. Her voice, though quiet, carried clearly on the frigid air. "Mr. Stone." Elias didn't move. He didn't speak. To acknowledge her would be to invite her in, and his world had no room for anyone else. Not since Eleanor. Not since little Daisy. "Mr. Stone," she repeated, a little louder this time. She clutched her shawl tighter, but her gaze never wavered. "I need to learn how to milk a cow." The request was so simple, so absurd, it hung between them like a cruel joke. A man who hadn't uttered more than a handful of words to another soul in 20 years asked for lessons. But her face was deadly serious. Behind the plea in her eyes, he saw something else, raw, quiet desperation. The kind that grips a soul with no other doors to knock on. He thought of the carriage, the wolf who had just left the pasture, and now the lamb was at his gate. His first instinct, a cold, hard impulse honed by 2 decades of grief, was to turn his back, walk inside, bolt the door, and let silence reclaim his kingdom. He had built these walls for a reason. Every stone was a memory of loss, every plank, a barrier against the pain that came with connection. People brought trouble. They brought hope. And hope, he had learned in the cruelest way possible, was just a prettier word for the heartbreak that was sure to follow. The laughter of his daughter Daisy was a ghost on the wind, a sound he could barely recall, and he intended to keep it that way. He opened his mouth to utter a definitive no, the word feeling foreign, a piece of rusted metal on his tongue. But then he looked at her again. He saw the faint purple smudges of exhaustion beneath her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands unaccustomed to the hard labor she now faced. He saw the quiet dignity of a person refusing to be broken, even as the world tried its best to shatter her. It wasn't just a woman asking for help. It was a life teetering on the edge of a knife. The world he had shut out had found him knocking, not with a fist, but with a simple, impossible request. The carriage, the woman, the plea. It was all connected. This wasn't just about milking a cow. It was about survival. And Elias Stone, a man who thought he was done with living, was being asked to help someone else fight for their life. The decision felt heavier than the weight of all his solitary years. It was a choice between staying safe in his silence or stepping back into the world that had taken everything from him. It was a choice he never wanted to make again. Yet as he stared into Clara Hayes' determined eyes, he knew a choice had to be made right here, right now. He looked at her standing there in the pale morning light, and for a heart-stopping second, his world tilted on its axis. He didn't see Clara at all. He saw Eleanor, his wife, not as a fading photograph, but vibrant and real, her dark hair catching the sunrise as she pointed towards the creek. "Right there, Elias," she'd said, her voice brimming with fierce, unshakable hope. "That's where we'll build the new barn. Big enough for a dozen cows, maybe more." Her smile had been the sun itself, a force of nature that convinced him he could do anything, build anything. The memory was so sharp, so visceral, it was like a physical blow stealing the air from his lungs. It was an ambush, a ghost stepping out from behind a door he thought he'd nailed shut, and sealed with 20 years of rust and silence. The world around him dissolved. The scent of pine and cold dirt was replaced by the faint phantom smell of lavender, the scent Eleanor always carried. He could almost hear the pitter-patter of small feet on the cabin's wooden floor, followed by the sound he missed more than anything on earth, Daisy's laughter. It was a sound like tiny clear bells, the true center of his universe. She'd been 5 years old, a whirlwind of tangled curls and endless questions. She'd follow him everywhere, her small hand tucked firmly in his, her voice a constant stream of curiosity. Why is the sky blue, Papa? Do the cows get lonely at night? Can I ride Shadow today, Papa? Please, he'd been a king, then a king of a small perfect kingdom made of love and promises. Then the fever had come, an unwelcome guest, a thief in the night, slipping through the door on a cold autumn wind. It started with a cough from Daisy, then a shiver from Eleanor. He told himself it was just a chill, but the fever burned. It burned through their small home with a merciless, unrelenting heat, turning vibrant life into hushed whispers, pained moans, and desperate, useless prayers. He remembered the smell of boiling herbs, the bitter scent of willow bark tea that did nothing. He remembered the endless nights sitting between their beds, a wet cloth in his hand, feeling their lives slipping away like sand through his fingers. He remembered the weight of Eleanor's hand in his growing cooler by the hour. Her last words, a faint whisper, "Take care of our girl, Elias." But he couldn't. The fever took Daisy 2 days later. He remembered the silence that fell after the last ragged breath was drawn. A silence so total, so absolute, it felt like the end of the world. And in a way it was. His world had ended. He'd buried them himself up on the hill overlooking the creek, right where Eleanor had wanted to build their new barn. 2 graves marked by simple wooden crosses he'd carved until his hands were raw, and bleeding, the pain in his palms a welcome distraction from the gaping wound in his soul. The dirt was hard. The silence that followed was harder. That silence had become his creed, his sanctuary. He had learned the ultimate brutal truth of the world, that connection was a debt, and the price was always unbearable pain. Kindness was bait in a trap set by a cruel and indifferent God. You let someone in, you let the light in. And then the darkness that inevitably followed was 1,000 times more profound, 1,000 times more suffocating. Over that hard, unforgiving ground, he had sworn a silent, unbreakable oath: never again. He pulled himself back from the edge of the memory, his jaw tight, his face a mask of stone chiseled by grief. He looked at Clara, at the hope still flickering in her eyes, and all he could see was a candle flame about to be snuffed out. To help her would be to feed that flame, to nurture it, only to watch it be extinguished by the harsh winds of the world. He would not be a party to that. He would not watch another person's dreams turn to ash. His voice, when it came, was the sound of that conviction. It was rough, like rusted iron scraping across rock. This ranch isn't a school. The words were a wall, a fortress gate slamming shut, a final definitive end to the conversation. He expected her to flinch, to turn away, to retreat back into the mist she'd come from. Any sane person would. But Clara did not retreat. She took a half-step forward, her worn boots crunching on the gravel, a small act of defiance that spoke volumes. It was as if she was claiming this small patch of ground, refusing to be moved. "My husband Thomas," she said, her voice trembling but refusing to break. "He's dead. He left me this land, 3 good cows, and a debt I can't pay." She lifted her chin, her gaze locking with his, forcing him to see her, to truly see her, not as a ghost of his past, but as a woman fighting for her future. "Victor Sterling, the man in that carriage, he holds the note. He gave me 2 weeks, 14 days to prove this place can turn a profit. If I can't, he takes everything." The name was a key, unlocking a door in Elias's mind he had bolted shut 2 decades ago. Sterling. It was a name that tasted of dust and foreclosure, of legal documents filled with traps for the unwary. It was a name that belonged to the kind of world that let fevers burn through a home and left nothing but ghosts behind. It was the name of the predator, the circling vulture, the uncaring force that took and never gave back. Sterling wasn't the fever that had killed his family, but he was born of the same cold, indifferent universe. He was the human face of the same brutal law of nature that Elias had surrendered to. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and he no longer saw just the ghost of his wife. He saw a soldier standing on a battlefield he knew all too well. A battlefield he had fled from 20 years ago, leaving the field to men like Sterling. Something shifted inside him, then a tectonic plate of grief and resignation groaned under the pressure. It wasn't kindness stirring from its long slumber. It wasn't compassion. It was something older, colder. It was the ghost of a fight he had run from, a rage he had buried alongside his wife and child. For 20 years he had let the thorns of the world win. He had hidden in his silence while they prowled, devouring the hopeful and the weak. He had let his grief make him a coward. Helping this woman was no longer about letting someone in. It was about standing up just once to the shadow that had consumed his life. It was a rebellion, not an act of mercy. A final desperate stand against the encroaching darkness. Not for her, but for the man he used to be, the man who had promised Eleanor he would build a future. A long, heavy silence stretched between them. The wind picked up, rustling the dry leaves, a sound like whispers from the past. He could almost hear Eleanor's voice in it, urging him, challenging him. "What would you have done for us, Elias?" Finally, he drew a slow, ragged breath. He had made his choice. 2 weeks he ground out the words, feeling like shards of glass in his throat, each one a betrayal of his oath of solitude. 6 a.m. every morning. Clara's shoulders sagged with a relief so profound it was almost a collapse. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back furiously. "Thank you," she breathed, the words thick with emotion. "I won't." "We talk about cows," Elias cut her off, his voice flat and hard, a desperate attempt to rebuild the wall even as he cracked open the gate. Nothing else. The first morning, Clara arrived before the sun, a silhouette against the bruised purple sky, her breath pluming in the cold air. Elias was already in the barn, the rhythmic sounds of his work the only break in the pre-dawn stillness. He didn't greet her. He simply jerked his head towards a three-legged stool and a tin bucket, his expression unreadable. The lessons were a brutal baptism. The barn was Elias's kingdom, and the cows were his subjects. They were enormous, placid creatures, but they had a language and a rhythm Clara didn't understand. Her hands, soft and accustomed to mending clothes and kneading dough, were clumsy on the rough teats. The first cow she approached, a stout Hereford with suspicious eyes, flicked its tail, irritably catching her across the cheek with a sting that brought tears to her eyes. She flinched, and the cow, sensing her nervousness, shifted its weight, knocking the bucket over with a loud clang. Warm milk spilled into the dusty hay, a wasted offering. Elias watched from the shadows of a nearby stall, his arms crossed over his chest. He didn't offer a word of comfort, not a syllable of instruction. He just watched, his face a mask of cold indifference. He saw the flash of humiliation on her face, the tightening of her jaw. He expected her to give up, to declare it was impossible. He almost hoped she would. It would be easier. It would let him retreat back into the safety of his silence. But Clara Hayes was not made of brittle stuff. She took a deep breath, her shoulders squaring. She righted the stool, picked up the bucket, and moved to the next cow. Her movements slower, this time more deliberate. She failed again and again. The cows were stubborn, wary of this stranger who smelled of anxiety and desperation. Each failure was a small, sharp sting. But with each failure, something in Elias's frozen interior began to thaw, a microscopic crack in the ice. He saw not a defeated woman, but a fighter refusing to stay down. She started talking to them, her voice, a low, steady murmur, the kind of soothing sound a mother might use to calm a fretful child. "Easy now, girl," she'd whisper, her hand resting gently on the cow's flank before she even attempted to milk. "It's just me. We're just going to get through this, you and I." Elias found himself listening, an unwilling audience, to these one-sided conversations. It was the first woman's voice to echo in his barn in 20 years. It felt alien, dangerous, but it also felt right. The cows seemed to think so too. Slowly, cautiously, they began to yield. The tense muscles under her hand would relax. The irritated tail flicking would cease. The true test came with Bess. She was his oldest cow, a cantankerous matriarch with a sour disposition. In Elias's mind, he called her Bess, a shortened version of the pet name he'd had for his wife, Eleanor. Bess tolerated no foolishness. She had kicked more than one bucket in her day, and was stubbornly loyal to Elias's touch alone. He watched as Clara approached her. He expected a confrontation, a definitive rejection that would finally send her away. But Clara seemed to sense this was different. She spent nearly 10 minutes just standing near Bess, not touching, just letting the old cow get used to her presence. She hummed a tune, a simple, nameless melody that felt as old as the hills. Then she sat on the stool. Her movements were fluid now, born of a dozen failures. Her hands found their place, and then it happened. A steady, rhythmic stream of milk hissed into the bucket. It was a sound of success, a sound of survival. Bess stood perfectly still, chewing her cud, as if she'd allowed Clara to milk her every day of her life. A feeling Elias couldn't name twisted in his gut. It was a strange cocktail of pride and resentment. He had wanted her to fail, to prove that his worldview was right, that the world was too hard, that hope was a fool's game. But her quiet, stubborn victory was a direct contradiction to the bleak gospel he had preached to himself for 2 decades. Later that week, during a rare break when the morning's work was done, they sat on a hay bale, the silence between them less of a wall and more of a shared space. Clara was staring at her hands, which were now red and raw, the beginnings of calluses forming on her palms. "He's making it harder," she said suddenly, her voice low. Elias didn't have to ask who he was. "I found a section of my fence cut last night," she continued, not looking at him. "Clean through. Took me half the morning to round up my cows. They'd strayed nearly to the canyon." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small piece of barbed wire, holding it out to him. Elias took it. He ran his thumb over the end. It was a clean diagonal snip, not a break from rust or the strain of a spooked animal. It was a cut made by pliers, a deliberate act of sabotage. He felt that cold stone settle in his stomach again. This wasn't just business for Sterling. It was a cruel game. "Then there are the rumors," she said, her voice laced with weary bitterness, "started up in town that I don't know what I'm doing, that I'm letting the place go to ruin, that I'm desperate." She finally looked at him, and in her eyes he saw not just fear but a burning indignation. "He's not just trying to take my land, Mr. Stone. He's trying to erase me, to make it seem like I was never even here." Elias stared at the piece of wire in his hand. He thought of the 2 graves on the hill. He thought of how the world tried to erase people, to smooth over their existence until it was as if they had never been. Sterling wasn't just trying to foreclose on a property. He was trying to bury another life. And Elias Stone, the man who had made a religion of looking away, found that he could not. Not this time. The piece of cut wire changed things. It was a tangible piece of malice, a physical manifestation of the war Victor Sterling was waging. Elias gave it back to Clara, but he kept the feel of its sharp edge in his mind. It was a reminder, a warning, and it began to unravel the rigid rules he had set for himself. His silence, once a solid fortress, began to show cracks. "Your grip is too loose," he grumbled one morning, his voice startling both Clara and a nearby calf. He watched her struggle for a moment longer before he let out an exasperated sigh. He strode over, and before he could stop himself, he placed his large, calloused hand over hers on the cow's teat. Her hand was small and surprisingly warm beneath his. A jolt like lightning shot up his arm. It was the first time he had willingly touched another person in 20 years. He pulled his hand back as if he'd been burned, his face darkening. Firmer he bit out, turning away so she couldn't see the confusion in his eyes. Another day, as they walked the pasture, he stopped abruptly. He pointed with his chin towards a cluster of leafy green plants with small white flowers. "Loweed," he stated, his voice flat. "Don't let your stock near it. It'll poison their minds before it poisons their bodies." It was more than a lesson about cows. It was a warning about the world, a piece of his own, hard-won bitter wisdom. He was breaking his own rule. They were no longer talking just about cows. They were talking about survival. And the line between the two was becoming increasingly blurred. He found himself watching her. He watched the way she moved, a new confidence in her stride. He watched the way she'd push a stray strand of hair from her face with the back of her wrist, leaving a smudge of dirt on her cheek. He noticed the way the early morning sun caught the hints of red in her brown hair. These observations were intrusions, unwelcome guests in the stark, empty rooms of his mind. Each one was a small act of treason against the memory of Eleanor, and yet he could not stop them. The symphony of silence he had so carefully composed was being invaded by a new quiet melody. This change, however subtle, did not go unnoticed. Men like Victor Sterling had eyes and ears everywhere. They thrived on knowing the weaknesses and movements of others. One afternoon, as Elias was mending a harness in his yard, the sound of approaching wheels made him look up. The polished black carriage was back. It rolled to a stop directly in front of his gate, the dust settling around it like an unholy shroud. Sterling stepped down, not with the air of a man paying a social call, but with the deliberate tread of a man staking a claim. He didn't bother with pleasantries. He walked right up to the fence, his expensive leather boots stopping inches from the weathered wood that separated his world from Elias's. "Stone," Sterling said, his voice smooth but laced with an undercurrent of steel. "I had hoped you were a man who understood the value of tranquility." Elias didn't reply. He continued his work on the harness, his movements slow and methodical, refusing to give Sterling the satisfaction of his full attention. "I warned you," Sterling continued, his voice losing its silken edge. "I don't like making enemies, but I have no tolerance for fools who get in my way." He gestured vaguely towards the distant Hayes property. "The widow is a temporary distraction, a piece of unfortunate business that will soon be concluded. Let it go. Return to your quiet life. The world has forgotten you, Stone. It's best to keep it that way." Elias finally stopped his work. He looked up, his eyes the color of a stormy sky meeting Sterling's. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with unspoken history. In that moment, Elias wasn't just a hermit rancher. He was the man who had lost everything, facing the man who represented the uncaring force that had taken it. "This is my land," Sterling Elias said, his voice low and steady, each word carrying the weight of his solitude. "And I decide who is welcome on it." A flicker of genuine surprise quickly masked crossed Sterling's face. He had expected a broken man, a ghost who would shrink from confrontation. He had not expected this quiet, unyielding defiance. Sterling's lips tightened into a thin, ugly line. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper filled with venom. "Everything has an expiration date, Stone. Friendship, loyalty, life." He smiled, a cold, predatory baring of teeth. "And her time is just about up." The threat was naked, stripped of all pretense. It was no longer just about a legal note or a piece of land. It was a promise of ruin. Sterling turned on his heel and walked back to his carriage without another word. As he rode away, Elias stood motionless, the leather harness forgotten in his hands. The air felt colder. The silence that returned was not the peaceful quiet of solitude, but the tense, waiting silence before a storm breaks. Sterling's words echoed in his mind. Her time is just about up. It was no longer a warning. It was a declaration of war. And Elias Stone, whether he wanted it or not, had just been drafted. The simple act of teaching a woman how to milk a cow had led him here to this precipice. He had inadvertently stepped onto the battlefield he had spent a lifetime trying to avoid. He was a soldier now in a war he didn't ask for a cause he was terrified to embrace. Sterling's threat hung in the air long after his carriage disappeared, a poison that seeped into the silence of Elias's ranch. The following morning, for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, Elias worked alone. The sun rose, painting the sky in shades of bruised orange and purple, but the gate at the end of the trail remained empty. He told himself it was for the best. He told himself it was a relief. The lesson was over. He could return to his routine, to the predictable rhythm of work and solitude. But the silence that had once been his comfort now felt hollow, accusatory. The barn seemed too large, too quiet. Old Bess the cow, with Eleanor's eyes, was restless, refusing to settle. She kept looking towards the barn door as if waiting for a familiar, gentle voice. The second day was worse. The silence was a weight. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, sounded like an approaching footstep, only to be followed by disappointment. Elias found himself pacing the yard, his gaze drawn again and again to the empty trail. He snapped at Shadow for no reason. He dropped a bucket of feed, cursing under his breath. He was a man coming undone. Anxiety and emotion he had buried 20 years ago alongside his wife and daughter was a venomous snake coiling in his gut. What if Sterling had made good on his threat? What if she was hurt? What if she was gone? The thought was a shard of ice in his heart. The possibility of another loss, even a loss he hadn't fully admitted he would feel, was an agony he could not bear. He fought it for hours. He tried to work to lose himself in the familiar, mindless tasks that had been his salvation for 2 decades. But his hands fumbled, his mind wandered. The image of Clara's determined face, the memory of her quiet strength. The echo of Sterling's cold promise. It was a storm inside his head. By midday, he could stand it no longer. With a muttered curse that was part prayer, part surrender, he strode to the stable. He did something he hadn't done for anyone for any reason since the day he'd ridden back from the doctor with the news that there was no hope. He saddled Shadow. The leather creaked in protest, as if surprised by this sudden, desperate purpose. He mounted the old horse and spurred him into a gallop, breaking the sacred oath of his isolation, shattering it into 1,000 pieces with every frantic beat of the horse's hooves. He rode not like a man paying a visit, but like a man racing against death. The Hayes place looked eerily quiet when he arrived. The gate was slightly ajar, swinging on a single hinge. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs. He dismounted before Shadow had even come to a full stop, his boots hitting the ground with a thud. He prepared himself for the worst, for silence, for absence, for another grave to dig. He pushed the cabin door open. It creaked open to reveal a scene that stopped him cold. Clara was there. She was lying in a simple cot, her face pale and beaded with sweat. She was breathing in shallow, ragged gasps, clearly in the grip of a powerful fever. But that wasn't what seized his attention. In the corner of the room, leaning against the wall, was a long-barreled shotgun. It was an old, well-used weapon, but it was positioned not as a forgotten relic, but as a silent guard. It was ready. Just then a neighbor, a wiry old woman named Old Maggie, whom Elias hadn't spoken to in years, came out from a back room with a wet cloth. She started when she saw him, her eyes wide with shock. "Elias Stone," she whispered, as if seeing a ghost. "What happened?" Elias's voice was a low growl tight with restrained fear. Old Maggie's expression shifted from shock to a kind of grudging admiration as she looked from Elias to the woman in the bed. "She's been working herself to the bone," the old woman said, dipping the cloth in a basin of water. "Fever took her yesterday, but that ain't the half of it." She leaned closer. "Two of Sterling's men came by this morning. Said they were here to collect some collateral on the loan. Big, ugly men." She dabbed the cool cloth on Clara's forehead. This one, she nodded towards Clara, weak as a kitten. She dragged herself out of that bed, picked up her husband's shotgun, and stood right there in the doorway. Told him if they took one more step onto her property, she'd see how well they could walk back to town with a belly full of buckshot. The old woman shook her head, a slow smile spreading across her wrinkled face. "Never seen two big men move so fast. They practically ran over each other to get away." Elias stared. He looked at the shotgun standing sentinel in the corner. He looked at the woman in the bed shivering with fever, but a warrior even in her sleep. He had seen her as someone to be pitied, someone to be protected, a fragile thing that would break under the world's cruelty. Just like his Eleanor, just like his Daisy, he had been wrong. She wasn't a victim waiting to be saved. She was a fighter. She was a survivor holding her ground with nothing but grit and an old shotgun. In that moment, something fundamental shifted inside Elias Stone. The last wall around his heart didn't just crack, it crumbled into dust. He wasn't looking down on a helpless woman he had to rescue. He was looking at an equal, a partner in a war he had just realized they were fighting together. After 2 days under the watchful care of old Maggie and a pot of strong broth Elias had left silently on her porch, Clara returned. It was the 14th day, the last day. She was still pale, a fragility clinging to her like the morning mist, but it was overshadowed by something new. The fever had burned away her last traces of doubt. Her eyes, clear and sharp, held the hard-won fire of a soldier who has seen the face of the enemy and refused to blink. She walked into his barn not as a student, but as a peer. Her movements were sure, her hands efficient. She worked with a quiet competence that needed no instruction from him. The lesson was well and truly over. They worked side by side in a comfortable silence, the air thick with unspoken things. Elias found himself memorizing the details, the way she tied back her hair, the determined set of her jaw, the sound of her humming that simple, nameless tune to the cows. He knew that when she walked away today, she would take more than just her knowledge of milking with her. She would take this newfound sound, this fragile warmth, and leave him with a silence far more profound and desolate than the one he had known before. The thought was a dull, heavy ache in his chest, a grief for a loss that hadn't even happened yet. As the sun reached its zenith, marking the noon deadline, Clara finished her work. She wiped her hands on a rag, her movements slow. She turned to face him, her expression a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "Elias," she began the first time she had used his given name. "I don't know how to—" She never finished. The familiar, ominous sound of carriage wheels cut through the air. They both turned. At the end of the long trail leading to Elias's ranch, 2 vehicles were approaching. Sterling's polished black carriage was in the lead, gleaming like a hearse. Following close behind was a dusty wagon bearing the official seal of the county. The law had come. Elias felt Clara tense beside him, a small, sharp intake of breath. He simply nodded a silent acknowledgement. "I know." Sterling stepped down from his carriage, a broad, triumphant smirk plastered across his face. He looked like a wolf who had finally cornered his prey. Beside him, lumbering out of the wagon, was Sheriff Dalton, a portly man whose loyalty was known to be as flexible as his conscience, especially when money was involved. "Well, well," Sterling boomed, his voice dripping with false sympathy as he strode towards them. "It seems your time is up, Mrs. Hayes. A pity. Sheriff, I have the legal writ of foreclosure right here, duly signed and sealed. The property and all assets thereon are now mine." He held out a document to the sheriff, who took it with a practiced air of solemn duty. Dalton cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I'm afraid Mr. Sterling is right. The law is the law. We'll need you to vacate the premises immediately." Clara stood frozen, her face ashen. All her work, all her fighting, it had come to this. A piece of paper was about to steal her entire world. But Elias moved. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't raise his voice. He simply took a slow step forward, placing himself between Clara and the 2 men. From the inner pocket of his worn coat, he produced a small folded bundle of papers of his own. They were old, yellowed, and creased. "Sheriff Elias," said, his voice quiet but carrying an authority that made both men pause. "Before you enforce that writ, you might want to review the document yourself, particularly the loan agreement upon which it is based." Sterling laughed, a short, ugly bark. And what would a broken-down hermit know about legal documents? Elias ignored him, his eyes fixed on the sheriff. I was a lawyer once, he said, the admission tasting like dust in his mouth. A long time ago in another life. He unfolded the papers. It was a copy of the loan agreement Thomas Hayes had signed, a copy Clara had given him the night he'd brought her the broth. I spent the last 2 nights reading this. It's a very creative piece of work, Sterling. He took another step forward, holding the document out for the sheriff to see. I'm sure you're familiar with Territorial Statute 27, Section B, Sheriff. The one concerning usury. Sheriff Dalton's face began to lose its color. Sterling's smirk faltered. It states quite clearly, Elias continued, his voice as sharp and precise as a surgeon's scalpel, that any loan against agricultural property is forbidden from employing compounding interest calculated on a monthly basis. It's a provision designed to protect farmers from predatory lenders. He tapped a specific paragraph on the page with his finger. Yet here it is in fine print. A clause that effectively doubles the debt every 60 days. An illegal clause, Sheriff, which makes this entire document and any writ based upon it null and void. The silence that followed was absolute. Sterling's face was a mask of disbelief slowly twisting into purple rage. He had been so sure of his victory, so confident in the ignorance of his victims. He had never imagined that the ghost of Elias Stone, the quiet hermit of the hills, was once a man who wielded the law like a sword. This is ridiculous, Sterling sputtered, snatching the paper. A trick. It's not a trick, Elias said, his voice dropping lower, colder. It's the law. A law you broke. And I suspect it's not the first time. He looked past Sterling directly at the sheriff, whose face was now slick with sweat. Fraud is a serious crime, Sheriff. So is conspiring to enforce a fraudulent document. I wonder what a territorial judge would have to say about that. He had not raised a hand. He had not fired a shot. But in the space of 2 minutes, Elias Stone had dismantled Victor Sterling's empire of greed, with nothing more than the truth and the memory of a life he thought he had buried forever. The war was not over, but the tide had just turned. The truth landed in the dusty yard with the force of a physical blow. Sterling stared at the paper in his hand, his face a contorted mask of fury and disbelief. The intricate web of lies he had so carefully woven for years had just been torn apart by a ghost from the past. For a moment, his predatory instincts took over. All pretense of civility vanished. With a raw, guttural roar, he lunged not at Elias but at the source of his humiliation. But Elias was ready. He moved with a speed that belied his years of quiet solitude, stepping directly into Sterling's path. He didn't raise his fists. He simply stood there, an immovable wall of quiet resolve. His presence, his sheer stillness, was more powerful than any threat. Sterling, a man accustomed to bluster and bullying, skidded to a halt, brought up short by a force he didn't understand. It was in that tense, frozen moment that Clara moved. She stepped out from behind Elias, not as someone seeking shelter, but as a partner stepping onto the battlefield. In her hands, she held a small, worn ledger book. She held it up not with a tremor, but with a steady, defiant hand. And this, she said, her voice clear and strong, ringing with an authority no one in that yard had ever heard from her before, is my proof. Sheriff Dalton, looking for any way out of the hole Elias had just dug for him, turned to her. Proof of what, ma'am? Proof of viability, Clara answered, opening the ledger. My husband was a dreamer, but he wasn't a fool. He kept meticulous records. I've continued them. She met the sheriff's gaze directly. This book details the milk yields from my 3 cows over the last 13 days. It shows a consistent, measurable increase in production since I learned how to properly manage them. She flipped a page. And these are the current market prices for milk and butterfat at the Clayton Creamery. According to my calculations, the projected monthly income is more than enough to service the legal terms of the original loan. She wasn't just a woman with a grievance. She was a businesswoman with a ledger. She was not just fighting for her home. She was proving its worth. Elias looked at her, and the last vestiges of pity he might have held for her vanished completely. He was filled with a profound, quiet awe. He had taught her how to milk a cow. She had learned how to fight a war. The air crackled with a new tension. Sterling's legal case was in tatters, and now his unspoken premise that Clara was an incompetent, helpless widow was being systematically dismantled before his eyes. It was then that another sound joined the standoff, the slow, deliberate crunch of boots on gravel. From down the trail, a small group of figures was approaching. It was old Maggie, the neighbor who had cared for Clara. Beside her was a lean, weathered farmer named Samuel Miller, a man who had lost his northern pasture to Sterling 2 years prior. A few others were with them, their faces grim, their eyes hard. They had seen the sheriff's wagon head towards the stone place, and they had decided that today silence was no longer an option. They stopped a respectful distance away, but their presence was a powerful statement. They were a silent jury, their faces a testament to Sterling's long history of greed. Samuel Miller stepped forward, twisting the brim of his dusty hat in his hands. "Sheriff," he said, his voice raspy but firm. "That contract, the one Mr. Stone is talking about. It sounds mighty familiar." He looked over at Sterling, his eyes narrowed with the memory of his own loss. "My contract had some mighty creative language in it, too. I'd be willing to swear to that in front of any judge." Old Maggie chimed in, her voice sharp as a needle. "And those men who came to harass Clara, they're the same two thugs who persuaded the Millers to sell their water rights last spring." One by one, the silent jury began to speak. Their voices, hesitant at first, grew stronger with each testimony. They were weaving a rope strand by strand with their shared stories of intimidation, of fraudulent contracts, of a community slowly being bled dry by one man's avarice. Sheriff Dalton looked from the damning evidence in Elias's hands to the ledger in Clara's, to the determined faces of the townspeople. He was a man who understood which way the wind was blowing. His loyalty to Sterling's money was being outweighed by the sudden terrifying prospect of facing a unified, angry community and a territorial investigation. His political survival depended on him making the right choice right now. He cleared his throat, straightening his posture, suddenly becoming the very picture of civic duty. "Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice taking on a formal official tone, "in light of these serious allegations, I'm afraid I cannot enforce this writ." He folded the foreclosure notice and tucked it into his pocket. "In fact, I believe it is my duty to open a formal investigation into your business practices." The words struck Sterling with the force of a physical sentence. His face, which had been a mask of rage, crumbled into the pale, slack-jawed expression of a defeated man. His power, built on fear and isolation, was useless against people who had finally decided to stand together. There was no gunshot to mark the end of the battle. There was no dramatic showdown. The war was won not with violence, but with a ledger book, a dusty law statute, and the quiet courage of people who had decided they had been silent for long enough. Justice, it turned out, wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was as quiet and undeniable as the morning sun rising over the hills. Sheriff Dalton, with a newfound sense of civic duty, escorted a sputtering, defeated Victor Sterling back to his carriage. The polished black vehicle which had arrived with such arrogance now looked like a hearse carrying away the corpse of a dead ambition. The small crowd of townspeople lingered for a moment, their purpose served. One by one, they offered quiet nods to Clara, gestures of solidarity and respect. Their glances toward Elias were different, filled with a hesitant, rediscovered admiration for the ghost who had walked out of the hills to become their unlikely champion. Then they too departed, their footsteps fading down the trail, leaving a different kind of silence in their wake. It was not the empty, aching silence of solitude that Elias had known for 20 years. That was the silence of a tomb, the sound of absence. This was new. It was the quiet of a storm that has passed, leaving the air clean, calm, and electric with potential. It was the silence of peace, of hope. Elias knew he should leave. The fight was over. His part was done. The old him, the man governed by the rigid laws of grief, was screaming at him to turn Mount Shadow and retreat back to the safety of his fortress before this fragile new feeling could take root. His solitude was a habit, a scar worn so long it felt like a part of his skin. To stay was to risk everything he had built to protect himself. To stay was to admit that the walls had fallen. He stood there, caught between two worlds, the past, a lonely and predictable sanctuary of pain. The future, an unknown territory, frightening and yet beckoning. He looked at Clara, standing alone in her yard, looking so small against the vast backdrop of the hills. She was safe for now, but he saw the broken fence, a jagged wound in the boundary of her world, a physical reminder of Sterling's violation. He couldn't just ride away and leave it like that. It felt incomplete, an unfinished sentence, with a resolve that came not from his mind but from some deeper, long-dormant part of his soul. He turned his back on the trail home. He walked over to his horse, not to mount him, but to unstrap the heavy leather tool roll from behind his saddle. The action felt monumental, a definitive choice. He was unrolling not just tools, but a new purpose. Clara watched him, a question in her eyes. He didn't offer an explanation. He didn't need to. He simply walked over to the first broken fence post and set his tools on the ground. She disappeared into her cabin for a heart-stopping moment. He thought she might be asking him to leave to tell him she could handle it from here, but she returned with a pair of worn work gloves and a heavy hammer. She didn't ask what he was doing. She didn't thank him. She simply walked over to the coil of new wire, picked up one end, and waited. They worked for the rest of the afternoon, and the silence between them became their conversation. It was a language of shared labor. The sharp, satisfying thwack of his hammer driving a staple home was a statement. Her steady pull on the wire stretcher was the response, the rhythmic grunts of effort, the soft thud of a new post being set firmly in the earth. These were the words of their new partnership. They moved together with an unspoken understanding, a fluid grace born of a shared goal. He was the brute strength digging the holes and setting the heavy posts. She was the precision ensuring the lines were straight and the wires taut. In those hours, as the sun warmed their backs, he learned more about her than any conversation could have revealed. He saw the stubborn set of her jaw when a wire proved difficult, the quiet pride in her eyes when a section was completed. She saw the deep ingrained competence in his hands, the way he worked with wood and wire, not as a chore, but as an art form, as if coaxing them to be strong again. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of mutual respect. It was the sound of two broken things being mended side by side. When the last post was set and the final strand of wire was secured, the fence was stronger than it had been before. They stood back, their shoulders nearly touching, and surveyed their work. The sun was beginning its slow, magnificent descent, painting the hills in hues of liquid gold and deep rose. The land looked peaceful, secure, protected. "It's good work," Clara said softly, breaking the comfortable quiet. "It'll hold," Elias replied, his voice a low rumble devoid of its usual harshness. They walked back to her small cabin, and without discussion, sat on the porch steps, the woods still warm from the afternoon sun. They watched her 3 cows grazing peacefully in the pasture, safe inside the newly mended fence. It was a simple scene, a quiet, domestic moment, but for Elias, it felt more real, more vital than anything he had experienced in 2 decades. He looked down at his hands, calloused and stained with the dirt of her land, hands that had only ever worked for himself, for his own isolation. Now they had worked for someone else, for something more. He looked at her, at the gentle curve of her profile against the twilight sky, and for the first time in 20 years a genuine smile touched Elias Stone's lips. It wasn't a grand, toothy expression. It was just a slight upturn at the corners of his mouth, a quiet release of tension he didn't even know he'd been holding. It was enough to light up his weathered face, to chase away the shadows that had lived in his eyes for so long. Clara saw it, and a responding smile bloomed on her own face, her eyes twinkling with a hint of playful mischief that startled him. So she said, her voice soft but clear in the evening air, "What's the next lesson, Mr. Stone?" Elias turned to fully face her. He looked into her eyes, and he saw not a student but a partner. He saw a future he had never dared to imagine, a path leading away from the lonely hill with 2 graves. His voice when he answered was not the rough, gravelly tone of a hermit. It was something warmer, something that sounded almost like the man he used to be before the fever, before the silence. "The next lesson," he said, slowly savoring the words, "is about how 2 neighboring ranches can help each other out." He held out his hand. It was a simple gesture, but it was everything. It was an offering, an invitation, a surrender. Clara looked at his hand, then back at his face. Without hesitation, she placed her hand in his. His large, rough hand closed around hers, a silent, binding promise. The grip was firm, honest. The calluses on his palm spoke of a lifetime of hard work and sorrow. The warmth of her hand spoke of resilience and new beginnings. It was the beginning of a new chapter, a new symphony written not in the key of silence, but in the quiet, hopeful notes of a shared future. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.